I would like to welcome everybody here tonight. We don't have a mic for me, but I said I don't think I need one. Can you hear me back there?
Yes.
Very good. I am very pleased to see such a large crowd here. This is wonderful. Must indicate you're either very happy or very sad. Those are two good reasons to be here. So if we could start with the Pledge of Allegiance, then we'll get into business. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, thank you, folks. I'm glad that Frank is here because he's the featured attraction. I want to ask him one question, though. I wonder if they have a parole officer anywhere in Congress. There's a few bad people over there. So, Frank, I want you to answer that question tonight.
I will.
Because with Barney Frank running his thing out of his house, Randall's still roaming around the halls and should be in jail, Pelosi flying around on all these planes, we got a lot of problems over there. So hopefully we're going to get some answers. So there's a lot of things that are going on, and Frank was there, is a part of it. He's going to tell us what was going on and what he did. So Frank, it's my pleasure to welcome him here as our Congressman.
Thank you very much to our Executive Counselor, Ray Resort, for being here and introducing me and saying a few remarks. First of all, let me also thank each and every one of you for being here on such short notice. I quite frankly wasn't sure when I was going to be able to get back to New Hampshire, given the debt ceiling debate that we've been having for the better part of every day of this past month. But I said to myself, whenever we do resolve this particular issue, which I think has captured and captivated a lot of interest in minds across the country, I wanted to come back, meet with as many people as I can through the course of August, and talk about this particular issue, as well as any other issue that people may want to express concern or opinions about, and also talk about what the course of the next 4 months is going to be in Washington. While I was in Washington over the last several weeks, the best way that I was able and capable to communicate with people was to do telephone town hall meetings. We had a chance to talk with quite a few people, and I got a lot of perspective on the particular issue of debt ceiling. I will tell you, when the President of the United States got on TV and asked you to call your member of Congress, you did. We got about 1,000 emails over the course of that next 24 hours. When I went into the office that next morning, I have an hour of tape on our phone system, and that was full with messages. We had about 300 to 400 people from New Hampshire calling in and giving their perspective in that 24-hour period. And we got a lot of different and varying opinions. And let me tell you, New Hampshire is all over the place on your position on this particular issue. And I read through as many different emails, talked to a few people during the course of this debate and dialogue, and I came to a couple of different conclusions. Number one, at least the phone calls and the emails that came in over that period of time from people in New Hampshire, people were asking to have an agreement put in place. Number two, people were consistently saying, we don't want to raise taxes. And number three, people were consistently saying that they wanted spending cut. Now, that's not all of the positions we got. Some people wanted us to raise taxes with a debt ceiling increase. Some people wanted, under no circumstances, the debt ceiling raised. But the majority of people calling and emailing had those three themes that they were saying. Get an agreement in place, make sure you don't raise taxes, and do what you can to cut spending. Now, as I watched over the course of the last month as a citizen, and I tried to do that as a member of Congress, be part of this, but also as a citizen, I was very frustrated with what I saw. And I was frustrated with my government. I was frustrated with many of my colleagues. And I'm sure for each and every one of you, it was also a source of frustration. And regardless of what anybody's position is on what happened over the last month, I do think that there's some good that came out of this process, and I want to articulate a few of those things. First of all, we have a government where each and every individual and every elected official gets to express their opinion and their approach to how we're going to solve America's problems. And that is still a good thing about our democracy. Second of all, we have a system in place where everybody has an opportunity to get their voice heard. That doesn't mean that your specific position is going to be honored by an agreement that's put in place, but everybody has that opportunity to communicate with me and their members of Congress across the country. And the one thing I want you to continue to do, whether it's a large issue like the debt ceiling or smaller issues, is please continue to communicate with me, because those communications do have an impact on the decisions that I make, as they should. And to the extent that I'm in New Hampshire, I will have town hall meetings. But when I'm away in Washington and I'm bugging you at 6 o'clock or 6:30 or 7 o'clock at night during your dinner hour and your personal time, I ask you to consider picking up the phone, listening to those town halls. I take as many questions as I can from people, and I got to tell you, I don't take just the questions where people tell me how great I am. I also take the questions of concern and opposition. And I want everyone on that phone call to listen to the concerns that are coming from New Hampshire. And those discussions help shape how I determine how I'm going to best articulate what New Hampshire is asking me to do. Now, that being said, let me kind of walk you through how this debt ceiling debate started and how it ended. If you all recall, maybe you don't, but back in January, late January, after I was sworn into office, we got a letter from the administration asking us to raise the debt ceiling, we meaning Congress, asking us to raise the debt ceiling without what they call a clean debt ceiling vote. Just raise it by $2.4 trillion, no questions asked. If you remember, Speaker Boehner at that time sent a letter back saying, as the Speaker of the House, he didn't think that that was good public policy. He had stated that he felt the debt ceiling needed to be raised. However, the course of public policy in Washington needed to change, in that in order to raise the debt ceiling, there needed to be some sort of short and long-term plan to change the spending habits in Washington. And that was because at the time, we were roughly around $3.7 trillion in spending and only $2.2 trillion in revenue. So as the year progressed, I was put on the budget committee. The budget committee went to work, did its work in committee, passed out a budget of committee, went to, that budget went to the floor of the House. It was voted on and passed out of the House, where it still sits in the Senate. We have since then started working on each and every one of our appropriations bills. We've passed 6 of the 12. I believe the Senate has passed 1. We're hoping that they'll pass a budget and pass their appropriations bills. But let me give you a heads up. When we return in September, we are likely to engage, because the Senate has not acted on any of the appropriations bills or our budget, we are likely to engage again in a continuing resolution debate like you saw in February, March, April, and May of this year. Or an omnibus, everything all in one package, and vote on that. So the debate and discussion on spending controls is going to continue. It's not going to get any prettier, I'm going to tell you that right now. We're going to continue to try to go back and forth because we have a divided government and we have very different opinions in Washington as to how to best get spending under control and how to best get to a balanced budget. Now, what's important to me is that I represent New Hampshire with a level of decency and respect and responsibility to try to do the very best thing on behalf of New Hampshire. And when I go to the floor of the House, and maybe some of you saw my speeches, maybe some of you haven't, I've tried to talk about policy. I've tried to talk about what's in the best interest of New Hampshire and what's in the best interest of the country. Just as I did when I was mayor for the last 4 years of Manchester, trying to get our fiscal house under control, I feel that that is my responsibility and obligation as your member, as your representative to Congress. So getting back to the debt ceiling. As we got closer to the debt ceiling vote, debt ceiling date, which was identified as August 2nd by Secretary Guinta, we in the House were asking our Speaker, Republicans and Democrats, for a clean debt ceiling vote. The President of the United States asked for it. Secretary Geithner asked for it. I had an opportunity to meet with both of those individuals personally. They asked us for that vote. So we went back to our speaker, Republicans and Democrats, and said, they're asking for it, let's give them the vote, and let's see how the vote turns out. On a clean debt ceiling vote, I voted against it. It failed the House bipartisanly. And there was a sense, at least amongst the House, that if anything was going to get accomplished, if any agreement was going to be put in place, that there had to be some sort of either spending controls or tax increases. And that was a serious debate and dialogue in the House of Representatives. And as we got closer to this deadline, the President of the United States, maybe you saw some of the the dueling press conferences going back and forth about what was being said in the different meetings with leadership on the Republican side and leadership on the Democrat side and the President of the United States. And what I can tell you, the information that I have, is that when Speaker Boehner and the President of the United States were close to the, quote, big deal that they were referring to, there were revenues on the table. There were not tax increases on the table, but there were revenue enhancers on the table, basically getting rid of some of the corporate loopholes that have been in the news lately. And the Speaker of the House had conveyed to the entire House of Representatives that he was willing to try to get rid of some of those unfair policies in our tax code. He also conveyed to us that that's when things changed. We couldn't get all the Democrats in the House and all the Democrats in the Senate on board because there was a need for tax rate increases. And that's when this deal really, the quote big deal, really fell apart. We went back to work in the House, and a group of us, myself included, decided to author a piece of legislation called the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. The Cut, Cap, and Balance Act was legislation that was accomplished three things. It cut spending in our first fiscal year, starting in October 1st of this year. It capped spending gradually over the next 10 years to 19.9% of GDP, which is essentially a historical average of where you need to be to have a balanced budget. And it also required a balanced budget amendment to pass the House and the Senate and go to the states in order for the President of the United States to get a debt ceiling increase. He was still asking for $2.4 trillion. Many of you may have remembered a press conference that he had where he said we needed to get this past his election. And that kind of wrangled some feathers in Washington. I heard from people on both sides of the aisle from New Hampshire who said this shouldn't be about politics, this should be about substance and public policy, and I agree. And what I will say is I think the President just made a mistake. I'm not looking to point a finger at him or at any Democrat or any Republican. I was there trying to make sure that we did the right thing for New Hampshire and for the country. So that actually, we got enough co-sponsors where we were able to go to leadership and say, this is the piece of legislation that we think is in the best interest of New Hampshire, best interest of the country, and let's try to get this passed and use this as the framework to get an agreement in place. And that actually passed, and the Speaker decided he would take it up. And I have to say, this is a very different Congress. When I talk to more veteran legislators who have been there for years, Republicans and Democrats, the one great shift that we have seen in this Congress is that as a freshman or a member of the minority party, you can bring legislation to the floor of the House. You can bring amendments to the floor of the House. That is good for democracy. That is good for New Hampshire, considering I'm a freshman. And it's good for the country because we have an active voice. It's not as seniority-based as it used to be. Now, there's still work to do on that. But I was one of the few who were able to meet with the Speaker and say, this is the legislation that we'd like to see come before the House. So he allowed it. And Cut, Cap, and Balance passed by about 234 votes, I think, the majority of which were Republican. There were 5 Democrats who voted for it. Went over to the Senate, and that evening, Senator Reid called the Senate into action, and they tabled it within an hour. No debate, no discussion. Now, here's what I want to say. Whether you are for or against Cut, Cap, and Balance, I firmly believe that credible pieces of legislation that are dealing with issues as significant as the debt ceiling ought and deserve at least debate and to be heard. And I think that was a mistake that the Senate made. So when that happened, Speaker Boehner decided to make a decision to continue to negotiate with the Senate leadership and the President of the United States. Now, my preference would have been that we pledged forward with cut, cap, and balance. I don't know how many people saw the CNN poll a couple days later where 64% of the country supported cut, cap, and balance. And it was another network that had to bring it to people's attention because CNN didn't actually bring it to people's attention. And a guest with John King, who was employed by CNN, a member of Congress, actually conveyed to him that CNN had a poll, and you can go YouTube it. John King was surprised. He hadn't heard about it. So that, as you can imagine, frustrated a lot of members of Congress, because with the politicizing of this issue and the growing angst in the country and the growing number of people who were concerned on both sides of the spectrum, we were committed to trying to get something accomplished. We were very committed to try to get something accomplished. This is a serious, serious issue for the country. And so many people from New Hampshire were communicating to me that it appears it's serious to constituents and voters as well. So the decision was made to, rather than fight for cut, cap, and balance, to try to find a framework that met the principles of cut, cap, and balance that could pass both the House and the Senate. What came out of that was the, quote, Boehner Bill, or the Budget Control Act, which is the actual name. And the Boehner Bill did three things. It still cut spending immediately at a little bit of a lower level. It capped spending over time, and it didn't require a balanced budget amendment to pass in order for the debt ceiling to be raised. What it required was a vote in the House and the Senate on the balanced budget amendment. And the theory was that let's try to get something accomplished in terms of cutting spending and capping spending in exchange to raise the debt ceiling, but let's also continue the discussion on a balanced budget amendment in this country and allow people across the country to continue to express their opinions and hopefully gain support in the House and the Senate. Eventually, if you remember, we were going to have a vote. Speaker Boehner held back the vote for about a day. The CBO score came out, and it was a little bit different than what he originally intended. So they went back, adjusted the bill to meet the CBO requirements of 5% more in cuts than increase in the debt, which is what Speaker Boehner had been saying. And then it was delayed another day because the votes weren't there to get that bill through the House. Now keep in mind, the Senate hadn't acted on anything. This process was being driven by the House of Representatives. So what the Speaker decided to do was add a component to the bill that got enough votes, which was a requirement of the balanced budget amendment. So it was much closer to cut, cap, and balance. It was a bit of a compromise, and he thought that this was something in his discussions and negotiations with Harry Reid that could possibly pass the House, the Senate. That passed the House, it went over to the Senate, and it was tabled. Now this was, I want to say, I think Friday. We have an August 2nd deadline. We met as a conference, and we started discussing what are the options we have. And let me tell you a couple things that were going through my mind, because I've heard from a lot of people who are frustrated that I voted for a compromise or voted for this agreement. And I appreciate your frustration. I appreciate the fact that people in this room probably told me don't raise the debt ceiling under any circumstances. And I listened to you as I deliberated on this decision. Believe me, it was a very difficult decision for me. But here's what I thought about. I thought about the days that I was mayor of Maine and how tough it was in the minority for me to get some of the spending controls in place that I wanted to see, that I thought were in the best interest of taxpayers and ratepayers in the city. And the way I took that big challenge was I took it one bite at a time. I proposed a tax cut for the first time, and it didn't pass. But I fought for it for a year, and we got it passed. I fought for borrowing cuts by 50%. I got it after 6 months of trying to argue with the members of the Board of Aldermen. Then I thought putting a spending cap in place made good fiscal sense, good fiscal discipline. And this was at a time when our revenues started to decline at the beginning of our recession. And I figured the best way that we can address short and long-term spending was to fight for a spending cap. And we fought it for years. Got it on the ballot, got people to vote on it. It passed. It was challenged to the New Hampshire State Supreme Court. And it was just, they just made their decision, and it's still legal. But over the course of 4 years, we got a lot of spending controls in place. So I took those lessons, and I applied it to what I was dealing with on the debt ceiling. And despite the fact that I think probably everybody or most people in this room don't want to see the debt ceiling raised, there are significant and serious consequences if that doesn't happen. And I'll tell you why. And it's not an excuse. It's not meant to frighten you. It's just the facts. We have $135 billion that we're short from August 3rd to August 31st. That's because we are spending more than we take in. So, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, if we don't have these structures in place, what happens is Secretary Geithner gets to decide who gets paid and who doesn't. Now, my opinion, debt ceiling probably, the debt interest would have been paid. Social Security recipients would have been paid. Medicare recipients would have been paid. Unemployment compensation would have been paid. And probably military. But after that, you have a whole host of vendors, programs, and employees that would not get paid. In addition to that, it would have automatically ensured a downgrade from AAA, one of only 17 countries to have that rating, down to probably AA. And some on the news, maybe you saw some economists would say, well, maybe that would hurt us, maybe it wouldn't. It might have been a double downgrade that would have needed to affect us. But let me tell you what it would have affected. Almost every state's borrowing capability, almost every municipality's borrowing capability. Small business owners with variable rates would have been impacted. Individuals with mortgages on variable rates would have been impacted. Anyone who has a credit card debt in this room, you would have seen your rates increase. And these are the things that were going through my mind as I was trying to make this decision for the country. Probably the most important decision that I've made as your representative in Congress. There are many people who voted yes for this, there are many people who voted no. And I respect everybody's position. Because everybody had to look themselves in the eye, in the mirror, and decide if they were doing the right thing for their constituents. And these votes are not going to get easier, they're going to get tougher. But I will tell you this, I'm not going to run away from these tough decisions. I asked to be put in this position, I'm in this position, and I have a responsibility to do the very best I can, both listening to my constituents and taking all of the information that I have at my fingertips to try to do the right thing. Would I have preferred a different structure of an agreement? Absolutely. Would I have liked to see real spending reductions starting in January to the tune of $100 billion a month in order for this day not to happen? Absolutely. But when you remember the CR fight, we couldn't even get $100 billion in cuts over 6 months, let alone $100 billion per month, which is what was necessary in order to avoid this vote and this position that we're in. Now, let me tell you some of the good things that are actually in this agreement. We have immediate spending cuts this coming fiscal year. It's $21 billion. Doesn't sound like a big number, and it's not. But when you take it over 10 years, it's $917 billion. In the history of raising the debt ceiling, we have never had spending cuts or reforms, never. Secondly, it caps spending for the next 10 years under today's rates. So 10 years from now, we will still be spending less on discretionary side. and not on mandatory, and I'll go through that, but on the discretionary side, what I refer to as the operating budget. 10 years from now, the spending levels will be lower than they are today because of spending caps. Spending caps that, if you're in favor of them, we couldn't get them when President Bush was in office. We couldn't get them when President Clinton was in office. We couldn't get them ever. And then finally, it requires a balanced budget amendment vote in the House and the Senate before the end of the year. Not as a condition of passage in order to raise the debt ceiling, but what I'm going to advocate for, because I believe in a balanced budget, and I believe in a balanced budget amendment, is that we get it passed in the House, we get it passed in the Senate. And we're used to grassroots advocacy in New Hampshire, but if that's what you believe is going to help this nation, then we have to collectively as a nation make sure that we fight for that amendment to the Constitution. We didn't get to this point because Democrats were in charge. We got to this point because both parties failed America. It took us quite a long period of time to get here. What I'm going to do is continue to take a bite at every apple I can to reduce spending, to get us under spending controls, and to get toward a balanced budget. I'd like to do it as quick as I possibly can. But I am a minority within the framework of our federal government. We don't have the cooperation from the Senate or the President on this matter of public policy. We still have very differing views on how to get us to balance. So this was certainly a challenge for the Congress. It was a challenge for me. I heard from a lot of you, and I know a lot of you are frustrated. I know a lot of you ultimately maybe don't support the vote that I took. Maybe some of you do. But I took all of this into consideration. I did the very best that I could do to try to get our spending in a different direction. And when I go back in September, I'm ready to start it all over again. Now with that, because I know the library closes in 45 minutes and where there's probably a lot of comments and questions, I want to try to get to as many people as I can, but I wanted to kind of give you the lay of how this worked out over the last several weeks. So with that, do we have questions or?
Yeah.